And as John McMullen writes at 97.3 ESPN.com, time is running short for the Eagles rehab club. There's a lot of guys, John, who are out with injury, haven't done anything, haven't practiced, hasn't been on the field. And let's take a little inventory on what we got here and where these guys are, and should we start to worry for the start of the season. Johnny Mac, my friend, how are you?
Doing well. How are you, Mike?
I'm well. At JF McMullen on Twitter, which you can follow him there for all real-time Eagles updates. And, John, let's get into it here. Got a lot of guys hurt that we haven't talked a lot about, but Fletcher Cox hasn't practiced. Jalen Mills hasn't practiced. Nigel Bradham hasn't practiced. Ronald Darby just getting back. I'll start with Fletcher. I mean, what's the deal with Fletcher Cox here? Should we start to wonder whether or not he's going to be ready for Washington?
Well, we are. I mean, you mentioned it's less than 3 weeks, September 8th, so we're 18 days, I guess. We're from the Week 1 season opener, and Fletcher has not done anything in practice, not even individual drills, not group install, nothing to this date. Early in camp, he was on the field rehabbing on a separate field. Lately, he hasn't even done that. He insists. He talked a little bit last week, said it was just part of the plan, and he'll be ready Week 1. I do get the feeling from the way he spoke that the Eagles are just being ultra cautious with what is their best overall football player, and I ultimately expect him to be there Week 1. He says he needs about a week of practice, and they seem to be sticking to that. So you might see a little bit of time that he needs to ramp up, but I do expect him to be out there, and we've talked about this a lot, and the cost-benefit analysis. Frank Reich, the latest, said today in the traditional dress rehearsal game, he's not going to play his starters. Everyone's being cautious, and I think the Eagles are being ultra cautious with Fletcher Cox.
Yeah, and if that's the case, what about Nigel Bradham? I mean, we know their linebacking core is already a little thin. He's one guy that, you can kind of depend on. He had a good season 2 years ago, not as good last year, but I think they're counting on him to be their best.
Yeah, Nigel, interestingly enough, finally got back to some work on Sunday, and he did 7-on-7s both days against the Ravens. So he's starting to ramp up. He's starting to get closer, but I'd be more concerned about him for the reason that he actually said he might not be ready for Week 1. And he said that he's not close to being back in team drills, and he doesn't feel comfortable yet with his foot, and he had ligaments in his toe, surgery for that. So Nigel, I would be more concerned about. And the second part of that is Camus Grugier-Hill, who would be the other starting nickel linebacker. He's already out for multiple games in the regular season with MCL sprain earlier in camp. So the Eagles are probably, I shouldn't say probably, because I think there's still a chance Nigel could get there. They're certainly going to be without one of their two nickel linebackers. They might be without both, and it's going to be close, from Nigel's own words.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see, what their linebacking core might look like. Let me ask you about a guy. We'll get off the injury spot real fast. When they signed Jonathan Cyprian, people thought maybe they might use him in that linebacker role. Haven't heard his name a lot since the signing. There was a lot of buzz when he got signed of what they're going to do. Haven't heard a lot about him since the signing.
Yeah, I know he's playing well. I think he's going to make the team. I think he's going to be the fourth safety. But, yeah, we did project it maybe because of what he was in prior stops with Jacksonville and Tennessee, that maybe the Eagles would consider him more of a nickel linebacker. But when he showed up, he was actually smaller. He generally played at 220, 221, somewhere in that range. But he tore his ACL, so he actually lost weight to keep things easier on his legs, now playing at about 10 pounds lighter than that. So they've only played him at safety. But as I said, he's going to make this team. And when we talk about the linebackers as a whole, and the Ravens were a perfect example, because understand what the Ravens are offensively. And when they do throw the ball, it's probably the most run-heavy team in the NFL. When they do throw the ball, they throw it to their tight ends. So they play a ton of 12 and 13 personnel. And that means we saw more base defense than the Eagles had played basically all summer, because they generally go 70% in their nickel looks. So we saw the three linebacker looks. Without Nigel, it was L.J. Fort in the middle, Nate Gary and Zach Brown on the outside. The nickel linebackers were Nate Gary and Zach Brown. So that's kind of where you're at if Nigel's not able to play. But the second part of that is they played even more big nickel, which is three safeties on the field with three cornerbacks, and that's where Malcolm Jenkins essentially plays linebacker. And that's, if you don't have Nigel and you don't have Camus, I think that's going to be Jim Schwartz's biggest look. And in that case, Andrew Sendejo and Rodney McLeod are the safeties, but Jonathan Cyprian would be very important as the top backup.
Yeah, it's interesting because you mentioned the lack of, I would say depth. They got a lot of guys trying to play linebacker. It just doesn't seem that anybody has really kind of grabbed it. It is tomorrow night an area that the fans can watch and see these guys, and maybe there is a battle to be won in the game tomorrow night.
I don't know. It depends how many the Eagles keep. If they keep 5, which I think they might, or keep 6, they might go light at that position because it's devalued. We talked about it. That's kind of like the running back of the defense. It's devalued around the NFL. And the Eagles do play so much big nickel with Malcolm essentially playing a linebacker. So I think they can get away with keeping one less body than maybe typically you do. So really, it's kind of already defined. As I mentioned, those other three linebackers, Nate Gary, Zach Brown, L.J. Fort, those are the guys who are going to make the team, along with Nigel and Camus Grugier-Hill. So there's no real battles. Nobody's pushing to take the job of any of those three. If they keep 6, then you have to start talking about, is it going to be T.J. Edwards, who's an undrafted rookie? Is it going to be Alex Singleton, who used to be a star in the CFL? So it's kind of that. But those guys are only in the mix if the Eagles decide to keep that 6th body, and I think they might not because of the versatility of Malcolm Jenkins.
What do we know about where Brandon Brooks is in his recovery? I think I saw that he just finally got back out there, but I mean, he had a pretty serious injury.
Yeah, he tore his Achilles, and remember, it was in the playoffs against New Orleans, so that's January. And you can see a 350-pound guy coming back from an Achilles. He's always had week 1 as his goal. He actually had a medical evaluation a week ago today, last Wednesday. And he had hoped, he talked about it before, that he would be cleared for teamwork. Ultimately, he wasn't. So the Eagles say there's nothing wrong. It's just part of the process. He's gotten back to individual drills. He's worked some in group install, but he hasn't been in teamwork yet. So he's another guy. He's sort of in that Nigel category, that it's going to be a photo finish for week 1, and it's conceivable he's not going to be able to start week 1, and if he doesn't, Halapula Vati-Vaitai is going to be the right guard.
Well, I was going to say, like last year, it almost was like Carson could have played, but they had an option that they didn't have to have him play, so they went with Foles. Similar here, where maybe Brooks can play, but we'll hold it off a week or 2 just to be safe.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. That's a good comparison because Carson wanted to play, could have played, and the Eagles were very cautious with him. And that could be the same situation here. Brandon wants to play. He probably thinks he can play, but the Eagles might decide to be cautious. And one of the reasons they might go down that road is they do have confidence in Vaitai playing, and he's played so much. So you're right. If they didn't have another option, it might be the other way, and he would be out there. But the fact that they do have a pretty good safety net might make them become cautious.
Yeah, Jason Peters as well. I mean, he's another guy who they've been very cautious with. Is there any thought that he's not being out because of injury, though, right? I know he was missed the end of last year, but he's healthy, fully ready to go. If they had a game Thursday night that meant something, he would play?
Yeah, Jason's completely healthy. In fact, he talked yesterday. He doesn't talk a lot, but he talked yesterday. He said he feels really good. You know, it's another year. He compared himself in a lot of ways to Carson, and the fact that people forget he was coming off a torn ACL as well.
Right.
And you don't feel right. And doctors say it all the time, and we kind of just skip over it. We say it a lot, but you don't feel 100% until that second year. And that's where both Carson and Jason are. So he feels a lot better. Yeah, I mean, you have to understand, he's in his late 30s. So the Eagles are very cautious with him. They have him on a pitch count. They give him a maintenance day. They give him plays off. But he's the starting left tackle, no question about that. And he's ready to go.
John McMullen at JF McMullen with us here tomorrow night. Of course, you can listen to the game on 97.3 ESPN. I want to throw some names that don't get a lot of conversation on the segment a lot because they're not the most intriguing names, or I think maybe just because they're not the high profile guys. But I think they all have interesting roles. What are we seeing or learning about Nelson Agholor?
I think Nelson's a really good player. And I think he's going to be more comfortable this year in the slot. Remember, especially late in the season after the Eagles acquired Golden Tate, there was a little redundancy from a trait standpoint there, and one of them was forced to play outside, and that was Nelson Agholor. I think we've seen enough of Nelson to know he's not a great outside receiver, but he is a really good slot receiver. And now that the Eagles have good fits around him, Alshon Jeffrey, Deshaun Jackson, he can play the vast majority of the snaps in the slot where he's most effective, where he has the most confidence. And, oh, by the way, he's never going to see a double team. I mean, if you're an opposing defensive coordinator and you have Alshon, you have Deshaun, you have Zach Ertz, even you can throw Dallas Goedert in there, who are you going to try to take away? Most people will try to take away Ertz and Alshon first and foremost. You'll probably have a safety over the top to deal with Deshaun Jackson, and that's going to create a lot of space for Nelson Agholor. So he's going to have an opportunity to make a lot of big plays. There might not be a ton of catches each week because there are so many bodies you got to get the football to, but they could be really impactful catches.
Yesterday, Peterson, now he had spoken yesterday, and then, we basically got the transcript right when you got off the segment with us here. But one of the things that stood out was he was asked about Myles Sanders and how much, he'll be able to contribute as a rookie. He says, as much as we give him. Now, we had talked a little bit about it. He had been nicked up, had some injuries, that might slow down his progression. But that doesn't sound like it's the case. Does it seem like it's the case? And will that change Jordan Howard the way we kind of thought he might? Is Sanders going to get more work than maybe we thought?
Well, I think he has that opportunity. It's pretty clear he's the most explosive back the Eagles have had in a long time, just from his physical ability. He's just got more juice than Jordan Howard. But I think he's like a lot of rookie running backs, and your concern is pass protection. If he can pass protect, and he held up really well in Jacksonville on that one blitz, which turned into the Greg Ward touchdown. So there have been positives already in the fact that he's proven to be a little bit better at that than most expected because he wasn't asked to do it at the college level that much. But just because you're not asked to do it doesn't mean you can't do it. And perfect example of that is Dallas Goedert. Nobody knew Dallas Goedert could block because he was never asked to in college because he was such a good receiver. He was used as a flex tight end, and he just wasn't asked to it. But he was a tremendously big guy. He's got a huge frame, and he took to it, and he became one of the better inline blockers, really, in the entire NFL at the tight end position as a rookie. So it's not like it can't happen. And I think if he can prove to hold up in pass protection, I think he'll get more touches and more touches and more touches because he's more explosive than Jordan Howard. So it's kind of up to Myles Sanders and how he handles that.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you about that running back spot. I don't know if we learn more, but Sanders, Sproles, and obviously Howard, they make the team. 4 running backs, and if there's 4, who is it? Smallwood, Clement, Adams. What's the feel there, and how important is tomorrow night for those guys?
Well, I think Corey's the 4th, and that's one of those things. And I put Corey in the same category as Matt Collins. The Eagles kind of default to those 2 guys. Probably not deserved, to be honest, because they have been injured a lot. They haven't been able to get out on the field. But they're still getting the benefit of the doubt. So when you talk about the other guys, whether it's Wendell or Josh Adams at running back, or it's Greg Ward or Markin Michelle or even Charles Johnson at wide receiver, their roster prospects have to do with how many are you going to keep. If you're going to keep 4 at running back, well, they don't have a chance. If you're going to keep only 5 at receiver, they don't have a chance because the Eagles are going to keep Corey Clement at running back, and they're going to keep Matt Collins at receiver.
So that'll be interesting, and also Boston Scott is a guy, I guess they like him a little bit. I just don't know where you find a spot for a guy like that on your roster, right?
Yeah, I mean, once Darren Sproles got here, that was kind of it for Boston Scott, unless Darren was injured. I mean, there's too much talked about redundancy. There's too much redundancy there. They do a lot of the same things, and you only can keep 53, and there's just not room for somebody like that. But it's probably an NFL player. Probably has a lot of NFL traits as a returner, especially. But it's the numbers game is tough.
How about tight end? Goddard, Ertz, Rodgers got hurt the other day. I'm imagining that they anticipate he'll be back.
No, it's not looking good for Richard. They have not officially updated. I think it's going to be a significant injury. It's the whispers I've been hearing, and that's the case. He was going to be the 3rd tight end. I think he's probably going to end up on injured reserve, and that would open a spot for Josh Perkins, who's a different type of player. Josh is more of a flex tight end. Was a receiver at one time in college, so it's a little bit of a different look, but it's obviously not as experienced, better receiver probably than Richard, but not as good a blocker. Richard probably more well-rounded. That's why he was going to make the team. But you have Dallas Goedert to play the inline tight end, and we all know how good Zach Ertz is as the flex tight end. So the Eagles will be fine there.
Yeah, I know we were with Colin Thompson the other day, who's one of those guys who's on the short list. And when any time a tight end kind of goes down, he always has his ears perked up to see if they get the call. And I guess that's the life of guys at the back end of the roster this time of the year.
Yeah, I mean, and it's going to be a tough day, and I think Colin talked about that as well. When you go from 90, remember there used to be 2 cuts. Way back, there used to be 3 different cuts. Now there's just 1, where you go from 90 all the way down to 53. So a lot of guys are put on the street, and then they're able to be brought back to the practice squad. 24 hours later, you can start building that 10-man practice squad. So it's a tough day, and
when
always
is that
on the
day?
Back end.
Right after the 4th preseason game, right? Like that's Sunday?
Yeah. The next day, yes, on the 4th preseason game. But they do have Will Tye. I mean, people don't talk about Will. He's played in this league. He's played on the New York Giants. And he's here as well. And they also have Alex Ellis, who's was signed late and is more of a movement tight end. He spent some time in New Orleans. He's a Delaware native, so they have some other bodies at tight end. It's not like they're down to just 3. And Will Tye specifically has played, NFL games with the Giants. So they have some pretty good depth, even though Richard Rodgers looks like he's going to be out for a while.
Yep, the tight end spot, we know they're very deep and talented there. And then as we talked about, some injuries there. Bradham, keep an eye on. Oh, Mills, he's the other guy. And you had talked about they could IR him, right?
Well, no, I think Jalen most likely will be on the PUP list because that is a little bit different. You have to start the preseason on the PUP list, and if you finish the preseason on the PUP list, and it looks like Jalen will do that, that means you're eligible for the regular season PUP list. So basically what that means is you would miss the first 6 games of the year. The difference between that and injured reserve is if you're placed on injured reserve in the preseason, like Joe Osman, who tore his ACL, you're done for the season. You can't come back. You can bring back 2 players from injured reserve, but they have to be on your original 53. So guys like Nate Sudfeld, Cre'Von LeBlanc, that's why the Eagles have to carry them, Camus, even though they're going to be injured into the season. If they want them back at some point this year, they have to carry them on the 53. Otherwise, they're done for the season if they're put on IR.
Tomorrow night, you can, of course, listen to the game right here on 97.3 ESPN. The pregame coverage starts at 6:30 as the Eagles and Ravens. Really, as you mentioned, Frank Reich said that the Colts aren't going to play. How about the Ravens? Are they planning on playing anybody tomorrow?
Well, John Harbaugh didn't say officially, much like Doug. I don't know why they're so close to the vest with preseason games. It's not like you can get a competitive advantage. John is more of an old school guy, so ultimately I do think you will see a little bit, certainly a little bit of their starters, but I do think that traditional Game 3 mindset of the dress rehearsal and guys playing the whole first half and going into the locker room and coming out to play the first series of the third quarter to get the feel of that, I think those days might be over.
Yeah. How do the players feel about that?
I don't think.
I mean, because I know Carson, he was asked the other day, he said, well, I don't really need to play him. I'll be ready for Washington. But is there a part of him that says, I'd like to play?
I think everybody gets competitive. I mean, if you're a professional athlete and you're out there, you get competitive. I think the veteran guys are, and you see this, I mean, we joked about Antonio Brown. Half of the nonsense with Antonio Brown, I think, is a veteran guy who just doesn't want to be at training camp. I mean, those guys know what it takes. And if you keep yourself in shape, and that's why I have confidence that Fletcher Cox will be out there week 1, those guys don't need it. It does hurt the back end guys a little bit more but the scaled back practices, I always say in life there's unintended consequences. So you can think you're doing great things for safety and cutting back practices and wellness, but the unintended consequence of that is if you're an undrafted free agent, if you're a guy who's 85th or 86th on the roster, you have less opportunities to catch the coach's eye. Back in a different era, you had plenty of opportunities, no matter where you came from. If you were undrafted, if you're a rookie tryout player, you had plenty of opportunities to catch the coach's eyes. That's now much more limited.
All right, tomorrow night we'll take a look at the game, of course. Check out 97.3ESPN.com for all of John's previews and coverage, the Bulls, the Bears, and all of it after the game at 97.3ESPN.com. All right, John, take care, man.
All right, thanks, Mike.
And John McMullen, the All guest, appeared via the Boardwalk Honda Hotline.